Good afternoon from a bit of a rainy London, and a big welcome to this webinar on the future of hybrid working, adapting to a long time shift out of the office. My name is Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of the publishing house Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants all around the world. And I'd also like to say a big thanks to our knowledge partner today, EY, whose support helps us to offer this webinar to as many public servants as possible. Now, in terms of the topic of today, I mean, hugely topical, but civil servants actually were increasingly working in more flexible ways even before COVID-19. But the pandemic has really forced home and hybrid working on a scale that nobody could have imagined even a year ago. And as civil servants and governments tentatively emerge from our different lockdowns, surveys across several countries have indicated that many staff want to maintain some of those flexible ways of working, in part, if not in full time. So hybrid working has benefits for employers as well as staff, can help cut property costs, it can help broaden the talent pool, it can allow people to fit their jobs around their own lifestyles and responsibilities. But it does come with some significant challenges, whether that's for individuals, for managers, or for organisations in their entirety. And we will be covering lots of those issues in our discussion today. And we have four brilliant panel members who I will introduce in a moment. But we are also going to leave time for questions from all of you, the audience. So you should be able to see on your screens a Q&A function. Please, at any time while you're listening to the panel members or when they finish speaking, message in your questions and we will get through as many of those questions as we can after the panel members have given their introductory remarks. So now, in terms of our fantastic panel here today, we've got a truly international global panel. First, we will hear from Anthony Gatt. Anthony is Permanent Secretary at the Ministry for Energy, Enterprise and Sustainable Development in Malta, and he has a wealth of experience across several ministries and departments in Malta and has represented the country at European and international levels. Then we will hear from Dominic Brankin, who is Director of Workplace Services at the Government Property Agency in the United Kingdom. Dominic has also worked across different departments here in the UK. And the Government Property Agency is responsible for nearly a quarter of the government's office estate. So he really is well placed to talk about the experiences of remote working in the UK civil service. After that, we will hear from Rupert Steptoe from our knowledge partner. Rupert is UK and Ireland Workforce Advisory Lead at EY, and he has spent the last decade working with public sector clients across the UK and in the Middle East on large transformation and infrastructure projects. So it'll be interesting to get his perspective on working with public sector and government organisations. And last but not least, we will hear from Dr. Stian Christensen, who is Deputy Director at the Section for Organisational Development in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he has responsibility for the organisational development of the Foreign Service. And as a diplomat in the Norwegian Foreign Service since 2005, Stian has held posts in Sudan, Ethiopia and Palestine, and has published several works on the subject of international cooperation. So it'll be really interesting to get that different perspective on what hybrid working might mean from a kind of foreign affairs perspective. So that's our brilliant panel. As I say, please do message in your questions. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anthony to give us our first presentation. Over to you, Anthony.
Good afternoon, and thank you on behalf of the Public Administration of Malta. I would like to thank you for giving me the privilege to take part in this webinar. It is my pleasure to share with you our experiences with respect to the innovative concept of remote working, how we see it happening, and what have been the benefits so far. While preparing my intervention for this webinar, I went through some literature related to remote working. It was good to read some interesting ideas, see important do's and don'ts, and go through studies on how we should look at remote working from the wider perspective, even after the COVID pandemic. One of the definitions concerning remote working that struck me most was precisely that adapted from the Applied Psychology and International Review 2021, which defined remote working as a flexible work arrangement whereby workers work in locations remote from their central offices or production facilities. The worker has no personal contact with co-workers there, but is able to communicate with them using technology. Our experience within the public administration showed us so far that one of the most important aspects of remote working is the culture change that needs to drastically shift from traditional office as we know it to an agile workforce. Equally important is trust. Trust between the employees and management and vice versa. Contrary to what one could imagine, the idea to move towards remote working in the Maltese public administration was not the result of the pandemic. We have been working on the idea to introduce the change in culture in support of remote working since summer 2019. I'm proud to say that the public administration in Malta is now becoming the model for other organizations to follow in the introduction of more flexible working arrangements in Malta. Unfortunately, the pandemic in early 2020 blurred some of our achievements to a certain extent. But now that we are so close to launch the official remote working policy for the whole public administration, our employees acknowledge the fact that we are leading in creating a win-win working environment that will make us the best employer on the island. As employers, we are departing from the traditional teleworking concept, a practice that has been around for almost 20 years within this organization. Whilst employees opting for teleworking still require in-person office attendance, our vision for a remote working environment goes beyond that. We want a culture based on results and trust where all employees can work from anywhere at any time according to their job suitability. Back in 2019 to 2020, we started off with a pilot project to test how we should implement remote working within this organization. The ministry that I'm responsible for, back then, the Ministry for Energy and Water Management, was chosen by the head of civil service to serve as a pilot for the actual implementation of remote working. Immediately, I started leading a steering committee to draft a policy to regulate remote working across the board. A sound remote working policy is crucial, in our opinion, to inspire our employees and facilitate the uptake of flexible working arrangements within such a modern context. The aim of this policy is to promote a healthier work-life balance, set up a formal framework for the administration, and motivate employees to work in a more effective manner, establish the concept of contact and core working hours, and streamline the process for remote working arrangements. The remote working culture that we're looking at within the public administration looks at 6 important building blocks. The first one highlights the need to have a shared vision, mission, and values of the organization, having all employees on board as one team. We are working to have all employees feel empowered and integrated within the respective teams. Secondly, the policy identifies the importance of enhanced communication within the public administration. We acknowledge that communication at all levels is paramount. The management shall ensure that communication reaches all employees at all levels including those working from remote locations. Another priority highlighted by the policy aims towards the digitization of all our processes. Working remotely with cumbersome, paper-driven processes is difficult and inefficient. Hence, the public administration is working restlessly to identify which of the business processes currently in place could be transformed into new digital processes. The fourth building block concerns the result-oriented environment as mentioned earlier. A remote working organization shall transform itself into a flexible and agile organization. Employees' workloads shall be driven by levels of productivity and be result-oriented. Remote working shall be based on results and the achievement of goals that are jointly set bilaterally or between teams. This brings me to the next priority, that is the necessary investment in leadership. A flexible organization should focus on empowering people and fostering trust while achieving goals on time. Through remote working, leaders should adopt different styles of coaching to enhance trust. Finally, the sixth priority highlighted by the policy considers the right physical work environment which the public administration will be creating to foster remote working. Over the past months, we have performed a number of studies to monitor closely the pilot project for the introduction of remote working within my office. This to gauge the impacts of the transition on our employees. One of our concerns revolved around the fact that some of our employees may opt to work occasionally from their offices. One of the questions that our professionals asked our employees was how much our employees are interested to work for most of the time from home or from any other place that is comfortable for them outside the current workplace. 1 being not interested at all and 5 showing high interest. As one can see, by adding those to answered 4 and 5, the total percentage of those who prefer to work for most of the time from home or from any other place that is comfortable for them outside the current workplace exceeds the 70% mark. However, almost 30% of our workforce is either not interested to work from remote location, slightly interested, or does not have any preference. We recognize the need for different realities. It is well known that the organization will require less space for individual offices, but more space for informal meeting areas. It is for this reason that we came up with the idea of setting up a number of remote workspaces across the island. The policy itself is being supported by the establishment of remote workspaces on a first-come, first-served basis. Our remote workers already have an app on their mobile devices to book spaces as required. As you can see from my background, the environment within one of these already available remote workspaces for the public administration is highly flexible and was aimed to foster the result-oriented mentality, as I mentioned earlier. Remote workers and remote working teams will be allowed to work from any of the remote workspaces available as and when required on a 24/7 basis. In parallel to this, we are aware that remote working may also present challenging situations, especially for our employees' well-being. Some of the challenges that remote workers may experience include increased isolation, decreased human contact, finding it difficult to disconnect, and increased feelings of stress and burnout. Almost 20% prefer of our employees to work from their current workplace. As managers, we are expected to support all remote workers and organize regular sessions for work-related open discussions to sustain motivation and foster effective communication. Our direction to the senior management is that at least once every week, managers should meet physically with our remote workers to keep this communication alive. Earlier, I mentioned the concept of contact hours and core hours. Whilst during contact hours, all remote workers are expected to be available at least by phone, the core hours are preset and agreed between managers and employees for our employees to be available at any location but in front of a workstation. The head of department is delegating the role to establish in our case, to establish the core hours to the respective directors of each particular directorate by means of the same policy that I have been referring to earlier. Whilst the time is limited and I want to conclude, please allow me at least to mention other areas just to skim through, which are of particular importance within our proposed policy. The policy highlights the process of how to convert an office to remote working, especially by setting a number of minimum requirements. It gives guidelines to the management to perform an analysis of what should be considered professional standards while our employees are working remotely. It also goes through privacy minimum requirements, minimum standards of equipment, which I also mentioned earlier, health and safety in a remote working context, which is also extremely important, the training and development of our employees and job suitability. Thank you for listening. I wish you a productive webinar, and I wish you also good health. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anthony. And it's lovely to see you giving your presentation from one of your new remote workspaces. So you're actually seeing that in action. So really good way to open there. I think you raised lots of points that we'll come back to with other panel members and in the discussion, the importance of culture change, getting people to think differently, the importance of trust between an organization and the employees. You're going, you know, as you say, a leader in this in terms of that vision of you can do your work as long as you hit the kind of targets anywhere, anytime. That's quite an extreme kind of situation. It'd be interesting to hear what other people and the audience think about that. And then also you raise there's some of the real impacts on office space and all the health and safety and what you might need at home. All of those issues I'm sure will be picked up in the discussion as we go forward. So thank you so much for setting the scene for us. I'm now going to invite Dominic to give his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and hello everyone. It's great to be with you today, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and to being able to learn from colleagues' experiences. And thank you, Anthony, as well. I think it's such a compelling vision there for remote working and for really pushing the boundaries of what remote working could be. And that's a very exciting vision that you've set out, and it'd be great to hear how that develops over time. Just by way of quick introduction to my organisation, at the Government Property Agency, we are committed to helping government organisations to support their people in improving the workplace experience. And in doing that, to support well-being and to support productivity, whilst at the same time helping them to consume space better. Ideally less of it, and to reduce the cost base as part of that. We work with departments to try really hard to create great places to work, so that civil servants can do their, be the best they can be in delivering excellent public services. And throughout the pandemic, our teams have been working hard to meet our clients' needs, to keep those customers who've needed to be in the workplace healthy, well, safe and secure. But we also shifted our focus very much onto how we could support the transition to large-scale home working. As Siobhan said at the outset, large parts of the civil service have embraced flexible working for quite some time. We've been supporting that through our Smarter Working programme, an assessment process, testing organisations against a consistent set of published public standards, and that is very much exploring how organisations are tackling the 4 pillars as we see them of smarter working: leadership, culture, technology, and the workplace. And when we think about hybrid working, it's very much in that context, that it's about understanding what the place element of smarter working might mean in the future. It's fair to say, though, that across the civil service, progress has been variable. Investment hasn't always been available, and some organisations still have a lot further to go than others. More recently, we've been turning our minds to 2 big challenges that I'm sure we're all trying to get our heads around. The first is how we can successfully support a confident return to workplaces for more of our colleagues in the future, and how we use that next phase to accelerate the adoption of smarter working. And in doing that, we're trying to draw on everything that we've learned about what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what we might therefore want to do differently. There's so much data being collected on the individual and organisational experience of large-scale home working, and so many think pieces being published on what the future might look like. So our understanding collectively is kind of developing as each day passes. But I think at the heart of all of this is really understanding the individual experience. We've been able to draw on our annual UK Civil Service People Survey, but we've also partnered with Leesman. I'm sure that's an organisation that many on the call will have come across. They've been researching the workplace experience for over a decade now, across sectors and across the globe. And we took part in the home working survey with Leesman last year. We had over 25,000 responses from civil servants across 35 organisations. So I'm very confident in the robustness of what that told us. And it told us a great deal about the home working experience, but also about colleagues' needs and expectations of the future. It's quite clear that even prolonged home working has worked pretty well for most people most of the time. We had 80% telling us that they were able to be productive, similar proportions saying that they had access to all the tools that they needed, all of the information that they needed to do their jobs, and 2/3 or more were able to maintain a good work-life balance, were feeling connected to their organisation and connected to their colleagues. So that's all great stuff. But it still leaves a significant minority who have had a more difficult time, a more challenging time over the last year and a bit. Plus, we mustn't forget a significant number of colleagues whose roles have meant that they've needed to be in the workplace for most, if not all, of the period of the pandemic. So in terms of what we've learned about people's preferences for the future, it's interesting how much similarity there is with some of the data that Anthony was just talking us through. On average, civil servants in the UK told us they would like to go back to the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week. So it did average out at around 3 days a week, I think, when we looked across the whole of the cohort. But crucially, about a quarter of civil servants were looking forward to returning to the workplace for most of the time. And so there's a real sort of combination of feelings and attitudes, and some of that might be driven by confidence, but we really need to continue to understand what's driving those issues for our colleagues. And again, really important that we don't ignore those people who haven't been able to exercise quite so much choice, and who we may have required to be in the workplace because of the nature of the work that they do. And of course, the personal preference is important, but it can't be the be all and end all. And we really do need to start with an understanding of what it is our business needs to be able to deliver its outcomes, and use that as the basis for the context setting within which choice and flexibility can be exercised. So really, the big challenge is how do you create an overall and rounded workplace experience that can take account of all of that, and that's very much what we're trying to do, trying to support a different kind of workplace experience. And I think there's a really important theme here about this not becoming a very clear binary choice. It's not about either or. It's got to be about both and. And looking at how we see a shift in the balance of activities that our workplaces need to support as part of a much more complicated and varied and dynamic way that people want and need to work in the future. So we're looking now at how we support organisations through the next phase of planning for, in the UK context, progressive lifting of restrictions over the next few weeks and months. Very helpfully, that is being steered for us by a group of senior leaders drawn from across departments. It's not driven from the centre, although our functions at the heart of government are supporting that, not just in us in the Government Property Agency, but in Civil Service HR, in our digital and technology functions, and others as well. And using all of that expertise, knowledge and insight to develop a whole set of guidance toolkits, playbooks that can help organisations work through these issues and make their response relevant to their context, particularly focusing on how we help and support managers. They're absolutely crucial in all of this, and there's a big ask of line managers in particular, but also how we support individual employees as well. So I think there are three sort of key themes that, well, it's certainly sort of occupying my time at the moment and trying to figure out how to respond effectively to them. And the first is one that was made by Kate Lister at Global Workforce Analytics about the importance of organisations actively planning and managing all of this. That we really need to avoid the risk of just letting it happen in a way that might not meet our business objectives. So that active management and controlling of the developing the narrative and the approach, I think is really important. The second one is this binary choice point. This isn't a once and done, one or the other choice between the workplace and home. It's much more nuanced than that. It has to be able to accommodate those whose home working experience has been poor in some cases. It's got to be able to accommodate those who've not had as much choice about where to work, given the nature of their roles. And the last point for me is how important it is to remember that we're all learning about this all the time. We've got to keep an open mind and continue to build our insight and our understanding of individuals' experiences. We've got to be willing to change as the data tell us something different. But isn't it great that we don't have to do this all by ourselves, working in isolation, and that, like today, we can come together as a community of interest, hear about each other's experiences and learn from one another.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dominic. Before I just move any forward, there are a couple of people on the questions, and thank you to the audience for already sending in questions, have asked what your 4 pillars were. So I'm just they were leadership, culture, technology and workplace. And just so I think you introduced some interesting elements there. So the idea of place, what's the kind of expectation of place in a hybrid future when actually where you work from is not so important. I think both you and Anthony have stressed the importance of listening to staff and listening to their experiences and making sure that you bring staff with an organisation as they move forward along. And then I really like what you say there, in that we're all learning together, and events like this are a good opportunity to kind of share good practice and best practice from each other. So again, lots of themes that I think will come out in the discussion as well. Thanks, Dominic. Rupert, I'm going to hand over to you for your opening remarks.
Siobhan, thank you very much, and hello everybody. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join the panel. As I look back on 2020 and increasingly 2021, it has been an incredibly difficult time for many of our staff and many of our clients that we work with across government. But despite that, I think it has given us an amazing opportunity to look at the opportunities to really reevaluate the whole organisation of work. And it's allowed us to accelerate the concepts of the future of work in a way that we couldn't have imagined before. And I think it gives us a chance to really put humans at the very centre of the work experience, supported by technology, absolutely supported by culture and workplace, and increasingly looking into the future, supported by machines. But can we flick onto the next slide? Thank you. So what are we seeing in EY? You know, we work across both private sector and public sector. We work with lots of government departments. And to try and start making sense of this, we are using 5 archetypes and those are in turn linked to 3 personas. And I think what's interesting is that if you look at these archetypes, that they are fairly straightforward. On the far left, we have an archetype that sees the workplace being very central to their work. Pretty clear delineation between home life and work life, and actually what we were all broadly used to before COVID. And actually also pretty easy to manage. If you then go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, that is what we then jumped to when COVID hit. And actually, again, surprisingly, the adaptability of our people, the adaptability of our leaders meant that we were able to make that work very coherently for most people. And I think that was predominantly because actually we were all facing the same experience. We were all in it together. We were all working on Zoom and Teams calls and all had the same experience. But from our surveys, what we're seeing and what we're hearing from the other speakers is actually what people want is that middle archetype. They see the office of the future as being a place to connect. They see it as a social place, a place to collaborate. And we have typed these as the hybrid hopefuls. Through our surveys, 80% of people want flexibility about where they work. 84% want flexibility about when they work. And 43% of those interviewed would prefer to be in control of their workplace and work time scheduling. Now, I think that gives us as leaders and policymakers real challenge. How do we meet the demands of our workforce and our people and the demands, the outputs of our organization? So if we then look at move on to the next slide. Collaboration and meeting space was one of those attributes of an office that was seen as the most important attribute, and also the single biggest reason why people interviewed would want to come back to the office. They want somewhere that they can collaborate. They want somewhere that they can team. But ironically, I think this is going to be one of the hardest things for us to actually achieve. If we look at the bottom left graph, this shows us that if teams work from home 2 to 3 days a week, which is what we're hearing people would like, then there is almost no chance of a team of people, of 10 people, having 50% of that team in the office at the same time. I think almost just as striking is that just getting 2 people into the office at the same time is only just over 10% if they're working 3 days a week from home. And therefore, you cannot leave this to chance. And we've already heard this. We have to take an active intervention in this. So how do we match these conflicting signals of employer preference and organizational planning? How do we create inclusive environments, both for those working remotely and those working in the office? How do we make sure that we can still team in a hybrid environment? What are the pay and remuneration implications if we're no longer working? I'm less relevant in government, but what do we do about things like car allowances if we're not expecting people to drive to work? So I think there are some really significant challenges that we have to make sure that if you come into the office, You're not then just stuck on a Teams or Zoom call in an open plan office, trying to do what we've all got used to doing remotely in the privacy of our own homes. We think that organisations and workforce expectations are going to evolve over the next 12 months. In fact, they will continually evolve. And therefore, coming in with a big bang approach is really probably not the right option for any organisation or government department. But that an incremental approach, testing ideas and testing things as we go, is going to be the right way of going. But going to the nub of the problem of time and location, I think means that we have to mandate some policy. And our view is that trying to do that top down, which if we're honest is the traditional way of doing it in government, is going to alienate our workforce very quickly. And therefore we are recommending that you do it at team levels and then work upwards and outwards to see how that impacts a broader organisation. But if you can get the teaming operating at a team level, and that will vary from government department to government department and country to country, then at least you're creating a sense of purpose and direction and value at the core of people's workplace. Teaming, I think, is going to become even more important than ever and more challenging for us as leaders to lead teams. Our people and leaders are going to need even stronger social and emotional intelligence. Being able to interact and understand your teams remotely is much harder than when we were all working together. We're going to have to know far more about our people than we were ever expected to know before. As the boundaries of work and home start getting blurred, we need to understand the context of people's home lives to understand the working environment they're operating in. As leaders, I think we're going to have to be very conscious that our own biases as leaders don't impact the policy decisions we make. It would be very easy for me in the comfort of my home to make decisions about what's right for me and people like me and not reflect what's right for people in our organisations. And I think finally, our people are going to need to have even more personal accountability. And to have that accountability, we as leaders are going to need to put far more trust in our people and really focus on the value creation rather than on where they are working and presenteeism. And all of us, our people and ourselves, are going to have adaptability. We've shown that resilience and adaptability over the last 12, 24 months, but actually as skills, technologies, and the ecosystems of humans and machines evolve, we are all going to have far more adaptable skill sets to be able to make this sustainable transition last for the enduring future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rupert. There is so much in there to unpack. And I notice you've picked up on things that we're already getting questions around. For example, how do you make the best out of the office space in a hybrid working? Why would you choose to come into the office? What's that office then for? And you mentioned connection, so not a traditional kind of coming in and sitting at a desk maybe as you would have done before. Really interesting points, which I'm sure will come up as well, about which I think Dominic touched on as well, about choice and how do you balance the needs of an organisation with personal preferences and how much flexibility do you give people? I think that's something Anthony mentioned as well. Really importantly, question about contracts and allowances and how does this actually impact people at that level? I think that's really interesting too. And then finally, things that both Anthony and Dominic raised as well, issues around leaders and trust in teams, between teams and managers and organizations, and the new skills that everybody's going to require in this different world. It's a different way of doing things. Thank you so much. And last but definitely not least, I'm going to invite Stian to give us his opening remarks.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you for the invitation. Certainly, as you mentioned in your introduction, an extremely timely topic, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with such excellent speakers, and I'll do my best to follow up. Hybrid working, as everyone has indicated and said, certainly on the minds of all employers, public and private sector these days. If it isn't, it should be, because it's here to stay. It will continue, and it will become the new normal, certainly. I'll try in my introduction just to highlight a few aspects which I think are interesting for the audience from the experience of the Norwegian Foreign Service, and I'll take it from there. To begin with, I think we should consider two big shifts after the pandemic. The first, which I think has been covered in a bit of detail already, is the fact that this is going to be a permanent way of working, hybrid working. We need some formal changes. We are working on them in Norway. I'm sure other countries are doing the same in terms of adapting legislation, individual work contracts, which certainly in our public sector specify the office as the workplace. All these formalities we can sort out. We just have a little bit less time to do it than we thought we would do, but we were already preparing for this before the pandemic. But what is more difficult, I think, is the change that we need to also foster in the mindsets of both the leaders, managers, and the employees about how we work, modes of working, and how we interact in the workplace. And this is much more difficult to chart the best path. And as I think Dominic mentioned, our collective understanding is growing each day. We're getting more data each day, and we don't know the answers yet, but we're trying to find them. I'd like to take one example. We had a survey in Norway, broad survey, public and private sector, which found that some 92% of leaders found that they had a significantly increased workload following up their subordinates during the pandemic. Certainly, some of this is and should be explained by the fact that we were entering into a crisis mode, but not all. And the evidence certainly also suggests that managing subordinates who are working from home, from outside the office, demands more for leaders, takes more time, and also puts more stress and demand on the leaders' working days. The point is that leaders' schedules are being more packed. We certainly see this across the board in Norway. It's more difficult to follow up, and we need to consider already now to take some mitigating measures. Logically, for example, should we discuss the number of employees ideally under each manager? Should we reconsider that ratio in the public sector? Certainly, other issues could be also looked into. Several speakers mentioned the issue of trust, and I think that a lot of more studies is needed to see how we should adapt in order to change managers' expectations of managers in terms of their oversight and control over subordinates and their work. The second shift that I wanted to mention is which we're not really planning for yet, but which I think is something we should begin to consider, is the fact that more and more employers, both public and private sector, will probably request more of their staff to work at home. I mean, so far in our office, it's been more of employees requesting to work more from home, but more and more probably we'll see employers asking staff to work part-time or wholly from home. And this really changes a lot of the perspective, because when the employee is asking for more flexibility, that's one thing, but when the employer is asking, that leads to a number of questions about the responsibility for health and safety in the workspace, and so on. Should there be allowances, for example? Should there be additional benefits? What are the responsibilities for the employer? I think it's highly unlikely that you can take that shift and not also take the responsibility for health and safety in the working place outside the office. At the same time, probably this shift will come, I think. Again, no concrete plans in our public sector, but there are just so many benefits to hybrid working and working from home. Cost savings in terms of office space, probably the most obvious, but the public also can expect benefits in terms of less commuter traffic, cleaner air in inner cities, reduced pressure on the housing markets in big cities, and so on. So this is certainly coming, and we need to talk about these issues now. Moving on, I think that just from the foreign service perspective, in particular, we are a global business, so to speak. We have 101 duty stations, 81 countries. So it's an international operation. And for us, there are particular possibilities, but also some particular constraints that we have seen throughout this last year. Significant for us is, of course, is it possible through hybrid working to reduce the need for stations abroad, or their role or their size? This is issues that we are looking into. Our experience so far is that there are promising possibilities, but there are constraints. A certain number of technical tasks could be moved to regional hubs or to head office. Travel costs certainly could be reduced. Another interesting aspect that we find, which might be interesting also to some of the audience, is that, of course, being posted abroad poses particular constraints on family relations, accompanying partners, life partners, spouses, their ability to work. Normally, they would have to quit their job or get a leave of absence. Increasingly for us in the Foreign Service and other employees, employers could probably now hope to attract competent employees from abroad, and with the spouses, partners being able to keep their jobs, work partly or wholly from a remote location in another country, which would really increase the mobility in the global labor market, at least for some areas. When it comes to restraints, the thing that we are experiencing is that there are a number of benefits with the hybrid meetings. For example, head office can participate much more directly in the local meetings instead of just diplomats being the representatives. This is certainly a positive step. At the same time, it's fair to say as well that we are seeing some limitations, specifically when you're already having a good working relationship with an individual, a person, an organization. It is quite easy actually to maintain that in the digital sphere from a remote location. But if you want to build up a new working relationship based on trust, hopefully, and in our line of business, often with persons that do not really have a common interest or immediate common interest, but very often actually opposing interests, is extremely difficult to build up those kinds of relationships without physical proximity. To take an example, we're not really seeing this very much yet, but I think in the long run, we also have to consider the factor that there is a certain kind of safety in saying no from a distance and through a digital media. So, for example, if you're in a new UN negotiation, you're negotiating a complex matter, controversial topic, very often you would have, say, 10, 15 mutually exclusive positions with 100 state parties actively engaging. And what really makes those deals come through is very often the fact that they're sitting in the same room. Over time, there is peer pressure, there is a little bit of stress placed on the physical individuals, and they also have a certain level of individual trust between them in terms of having been in physical proximity and worked together on issues for a long time. So I think we also need to consider that there may be some substantial changes if we move too rapidly and too soon and with a big bang, as I think possibly was Rupert who mentioned that term. This will make it a little bit more difficult if we have hybrid meetings or full digital meetings replacing physical meetings in all contexts. It will be also more difficult to actually get progress on those difficult topics. So in conclusion, I would say that ironically, there is a risk that in our search for more cost-effective ways of doing business, we could lose out in the long run. As with all new things, we should embrace the new possibilities, but with the realism, moderation, and pacing. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Sten. I think good at the end, I think you've mirrored what several people have said, is that we need to do this pragmatically and with realism going forward, not a big bang one-off approach. Really interesting to see the Foreign Office perspective. So the idea of whether you could significantly reduce kind of the need for foreign travel, the need for smaller posts abroad. And again, that sense of it might be better for spouses. You can then broaden your talent pool as well if you're not requiring people to move all the time. I think the thing you mentioned right at the end there around it's easier to maintain existing relationships, maybe in a hybrid future, rather than build new ones, also impacts new starters, for example, in an organization who are trying to build relationships, maybe with their team and their organization. And that has come up in previous conversations we've had on this issue. So a big thanks to all of our panel members for those opening comments. We've had loads of questions coming in. What I'm going to do is bundle up a couple of questions at a time, otherwise we're not going to be able to get through all of them. People have asked, there are a couple of questions come in, and I think this has been touched on by all of you in your presentations, is who is responsible for ensuring that the home environment is as safe and secure as the office environment? So whose responsibility is that? How much can people reasonably expect from their employer in terms of creating a safe environment at home? And I'm going to add to that one for all of you. Do you think it's reasonable or feasible for people to actually work from a different country? I know that might be interesting for you in particular, Steen, but I think also, Anthony, you were saying anywhere, anytime. How far does that really go in reality? Anthony, it's been a while since we heard from you, so I'm going to come to you first. What can people expect in terms of their home environment, and could they be working from abroad even?
So thank you again, and thank you also.
Anthony, you're a little bit quiet. Where you could come.
All right, sorry, Mela. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to the other panelists as well. It was very interesting to listen to their presentations, and I noticed huge similarity in what they have said in their presentations, especially with regards to statistics and the expectations of our employees. With regards to your question, the home environment in our case, the responsibility has been shifted completely to our employees. The reason being very specific, because we're not discussing working from home. In my presentation, I've mentioned teleworking, which has been there for almost 20 years in the public administration of Malta. And that kind of arrangement was specifically linked to one location, which was from home. Now we're talking about something completely different. I have employees working from Belgium, for example, already. I have employees who prefer to work from a cafeteria, which is close to where they live. I have others who prefer to go to a park and work from there. So the responsibility, to go back to your question, we've shifted, to answer your question, we've shifted. There is this responsibility completely on our employees. Sorry, I forgot your second question. If you could repeat it quickly, please.
I think you've done them both. Could they work abroad even? And I think you've answered, you don't really mind.
So, all right. So, okay. All right.
Fantastic. Thank you. Rupert, I'm going to come to you on this one. So I think maybe you have a slightly different approach from what you were saying.
Thanks, Siobhan. I mean, on the first question, I think there is a difference between the legal argument, which around working from home, which I'm not going to get into and I'm not qualified to get into. But I think we have a moral responsibility as organisations to look after our workforces wherever they are working. And the breadth of that, I think, is going to be a really interesting point. And I think it's going to be one of those things that will evolve over time. So we have put a lot of effort into making sure our people are able to access the right IT, that they're able to get the right desks, the right chairs, and protect them against back pain and neck pain. But whether that then extends to them having an accident, falling down the stairs, getting their cup of coffee in the morning, starts getting into very difficult ground and not one that I could answer. But I do think the moral responsibility is on us to make sure that our people are able to work as effectively from their home environment as they can from their work environment. And actually, Anthony, I completely agree. It doesn't have to be the home environment. It could be another location that isn't the corporate office or the government department. Working from abroad, again, I think will depend on organizations. The technology means that is completely feasible. Some government departments will need to be able to, and already have workforces that are working abroad. For ourselves, there are significant, in the private sector, significant tax implications that mean that we can't work abroad. So we have to conduct our work from the UK, and therefore we have had to take a much stricter line on that with our staff than our hearts would have wanted,
Mm.
particularly with the challenges of COVID, with the many overseas staff and with families in varying parts of the world.
Thanks. I think it just shows how complicated this all becomes when you start getting into some of these contractual and legal issues as well. Stian, I'm going to come to you next. Obviously, you're all about working in different countries, but what about this issue of kind of the home environment and how much can be expected?
Well, I think good points were made already. Another perspective, I think, would be labor unions, which probably would not let this issue rest either. And I think that we can certainly expect labor unions to take up this issue from the perspective that Rupert mentioned, the moral perspective, and the viewpoint that employers, especially if they request employees actively to work from outside the office, that they also have responsibility to ensure a safe and healthy working environment in various aspects. There are legal issues to that, as has also been mentioned, insurance claims and so on. When it comes to working from abroad, this is something that we have been looking at for many years, and there are in fact a significant number of legal constraints. In addition to taxes, which was mentioned, there is also health insurance, public health insurance, a number of issues which makes this in practice very difficult, even though the technical possibilities have been there for years. In the end, it's a question of governments looking seriously into this and trying to increase the flexibility for those kinds of tasks being done from other countries, within reason, of course. And then secondly, for businesses themselves to decide which of their tasks may be suitable for periods of time, extended periods of time, to be done by people working from other countries.
Thanks. Dominic, without wanting to duplicate what other people have said, is this something that the GPA have been considering? And I'm thinking in particular, maybe from a diversity point of view, people that had reasonable adjustments in the office, can they expect those also to be put in place at home?
They absolutely should expect those to be put in place at home. I think on the health and safety question, in UK, health and safety executive guidance is quite clear that it's the employer's accountability to ensure a risk assessment is undertaken. It's the employee's responsibility then to comply with the outcome of that risk assessment. I think there are some broader themes here that we also need to consider. So as well as health and safety, security is important, including information security. Some colleagues on the call may have been at last week's GGF webinar, where another of your knowledge partners, Dell Technologies, Tariq Hussain, was talking through research that Dell had sponsored on the UK civil service experience of home working, and that very clearly identified information security and technology security as probably an area that we need to do a bit more thinking about and pay a little bit more attention to. And I think protecting our people in that respect is equally important. There is another sort of diversity and inclusion perspective here, because the home working experience, we know, is driven largely by the home work setting that an individual is able to create. And people who've got access to a dedicated work setting, or even better, a private dedicated work setting at home, by far have a much better home working experience than those who can't. And those who are less likely to be able to do that are younger, earlier in their career. In the UK, will largely be in London and the South East, and are more likely to be from an ethnic minority background. So it's really important when we're looking at this in the round that we're considering all of these factors that influence the working experience, whether it's at home or in the office. And yeah, probably nothing more to add on the working from abroad point, I think.
Yeah, interesting. We did have a question in from Spencer about age, and whether age is a factor in whether people prefer to come into the office or stay at home. And I think what you're saying is it's probably younger people who tend to be new starters are feeling like they might want to come into the office more. So I think
yeah, could I come back on that,
yeah,
Siobhan?
sure.
Because that is true, and certainly that's what our research is showing. But also people who are more senior in their careers who may therefore be older, tend to have more complex job roles. And role complexity is another big driver of the home working experience. And the more complex somebody's role is, the less likely they are to have had a positive experience at home. Not dramatically different,
Right.
but you can potentially start to see a bell curve emerging there in terms of the quality of the home working experience.
Right. Okay, we really do have lots of questions. So again, I'm going to group a few together. So both Melanie and Jeremy have asked about the dangers of a two-tier system opening up, whereby people who go into the office more get seen more, they get recognized more, they create networks more than people who stay at home. And there's a danger that the implications of that might not be seen for several years, at which point it's too late. So some people get left behind. So how do we mitigate against that kind of happening? And then also I want to pick up this point that several people have mentioned about what happens in a new future where people see flexibility as a benefit to those people who can't work flexibly, and are there genuinely jobs? The obvious ones, people that have to be in a laboratory, but maybe other people who are advising ministers, for example, are there genuinely jobs that will never be able to be done remotely? And if so, how are those people supported in a hybrid future? So 2 questions, people who can't work remotely and the dangers of a two-tier system. Dominic, I'm going to start with you on these.
They are great questions, and they're going to be, I think, tough nuts to crack. Because that sort of two-tier workforce and two-tier experience, I think, does absolutely apply in the way you've described, but it does connect the two issues, because it's not just a question of those who choose to be present, but it's about those who don't have that choice, and how do you balance those things. I think part of that, particularly on the latter point, in terms of colleagues whose roles require them to be in the workplace, and when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about everything from scientists in laboratories to prison officers in prisons, people guarding the borders. Sometimes, yes, it's about how people engage with ministers, but we mustn't forget that ministers have been hybrid working for years, between their constituencies, their departments, parliament, and goodness knows where else. And a lot of those sort of obstacles, I think, are being chipped away at on a gradual basis. Is to make sure that the workplace experience when people are in the workplace, is also supporting a whole variety of activity that people need to undertake. I think it would be dangerous to fall into a trap to think that our workplaces, our offices, are all going to become big collaboration hubs and nothing more, when they still have to support the full range of activity individuals undertake. So having a quality environment, I think, is a really important part of that. Without wanting to steal Stian's thunder, one of the points he was making about the impact on the line management relationship, and thinking about, whether that means you have to reduce the span of control to give a line manager the time to be able to invest in everyone, is a really important potential mitigation here. So it absolutely doesn't become part of an issue about who I can see from where I am driving behaviour, rather than the relationships with everybody in a team.
Brilliant, thanks, Dominic. Well, Stian, I'm going to come to you then for your thoughts on this. So that avoiding a two-tier approach, and how do you deal with people that don't have choice?
Thank you, Siobhan. I find myself in to a high degree of agreement with Dominic on this one. I'd say yes, there is certainly danger. Yes, we have seen this as a danger throughout the entire pandemic and the crisis. I think that manager accessibility is a key point, and the equal access to the manager is important. At the same time, keeping in mind that, as I mentioned in my introduction, managers' capacity is actually much more strained with people working from home. Rotation is also something to be considered, but as was highlighted, I think in Rupert's introduction, it's actually very difficult to make it work in practice. So we haven't cracked that one yet, but it's one thing that we need to look at. And then I think that also managers increasingly need to, or I mean, they should do it already, but even more so, they need to consider inclusion in terms of physical common meeting spaces, seminars, etc., and bringing teams together, I think will be important.
Great, thank you. Anthony, is this even going to be an issue in Malta? I mean, will there be people who tend to go more into the office, or has that just been completely eradicated with your approach?
Yes, first of all, it's completely up to our employees to decide how and when to go to the available remote workspaces. But obviously, through the policy, we're trying to ensure that the same rules and regulations apply for all employees, equal opportunities and whatnot. With regards to the other question, for concerning people who cannot work remotely, yes, I do understand that there are certain roles that cannot be performed remotely, but it is at least as managers, we should do everything possible in our control to make jobs possible or suitable for remote working. And that is something that will require certain flair, thinking outside the box. As I said in my introduction, for example, one of the enablers for remote working is certainly digitalization. So we have to think, for example, in areas of digitalization.
Thanks, Anthony. Rupert, did you have anything? Is this something that you work with or thinking about?
So, I'm going to put a slightly different view on this. In that, I think we have to be careful not to mix up remote working and hybrid working with flexible working, which most organisations have had for many years, and many of the challenges of a two-tier system were apparent in a flexible working environment. In fact, were probably more apparent in a flexible working environment where some people, through either choice or not through choice, were forced to work in a very different way to their colleagues. I think the exciting opportunity about hybrid working is that much more of the workforce is going to be having a much more similar experience. And so therefore, I don't think, I think there is a risk, but I think there's a much greater opportunity to actually break down the barriers of flexible working, because so many more of us will be in and out of the office on different days and not creating those same real life networks that we might have done before, and that we've got much better at creating those networks virtually and have learned how to operate virtually. I think there is a bigger societal question around those jobs that force people to work or have to work in a workplace, and those jobs that allow people to work hybrid or flexibly. Because actually, I think, one, it's going to become increasingly attractive for younger people to be able to work in organizations that offer hybrid working. But secondly, there is almost a perception issue about those people who are going to be working frontline and those who are going to be more office-based or working from home. And, you know, some of the work I've done in arm's length bodies in the UK, like Network Rail and Highways England, where you have a big operational workforce balanced against the management workforce, and the difference, the perception difference of one being treated in one way and being allowed to work from home, and the rest of the workforce being treated in another way and being expected to be on site every day. And I think that's where you could have real frictions.
Yeah, it's going to raise all sorts of issues about equality of roles and equality of operations. Really interesting, because we did have a question in around what's the terminology, and I think we've heard today there are so many different things. So there's remote working, hybrid working, flexible working, smarter working, teleworking, and I think all those things have slightly different meanings, and that over time will emerge what we mean by the various things. We are almost out of time. I can't believe how many questions we've got coming in. So I'm sorry if we can't get to your question, but this in face-to-face, this would be where you could have kind of grabbed somebody, a panel member, after the panel and asked them your question. So what we will do instead is we will try and get some of those questions answered for you on email afterwards. So I'm really sorry if we haven't managed to get through all your questions. But in terms of a final round of questions, and before I get to those, just to say in the audience, thank you for all those questions. And we have just sent a survey out, a feedback survey. So if you have a few minutes to answer that, please do, because it gives us an opportunity to make sure we are providing the kind of webinars that you really want. So if you have got a few minutes to answer that, that would be great. But in terms of the final two questions I'm going to put you on, I'm afraid you'll have to answer them quite quickly because we're nearly at the end of our time. We've had a couple of questions in, and I think in particular, I think Rupert, you touched on this, is do you think we will end up with a kind of optimum model for teams, like how many days a week they might come into the office, and to what extent should that be kind of mandated by an organization? So people have asked about that. And then the final question somebody has asked is, all of you have talked about culture change, and this is a shift in mindset. Is there a danger as we get further and further from this year and the experience of the pandemic that we all fall back into old habits and we basically drift back into full-time in the office being the default? So those are the two questions. Stian, I'm going to come to you first on those.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. I'll try to be brief. Just in terms of the optimum way of working, I would say that it depends completely on the business, the tasks, what is actually needs to be solved. So I do not think that there will be an optimum way of working. Also depends on the individual employees, of course, and their preferences and their needs and so on. So we probably just need to have more. The optimum way of working or managing a workforce will be to be more flexible and increasing the social skills of managers in order to extend that flexibility to the workforce, I think. When it comes to the second question, which was about, sorry, remind me again.
It was, will we fall back into old ways of
right.
working?
No, I think that some managers will be tempted to try to turn back the clock, but it will prove completely impossible. That's the short answer, I think. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Anthony, your thoughts on those 2 points?
So regarding your first question, in our opinion at least, so far, absolutely not. We're leaving it up for our employees to decide when they want to visit their offices, etc. So it's completely up to them. We're basing our idea on a results-oriented organization. So that's my first answer. Secondly, I wouldn't link this, as I said also earlier, I wouldn't link remote working with the pandemic, because that could possibly lead, yes, to going back to where we were before the pandemic. So I wouldn't suggest to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been really interesting to hear from Moldra. I think you're at such a kind of innovative, you want to push it as far as it can go, which has been really interesting to hear. Rupert, your thoughts on this?
I think I agree with Steen. I think it would be very, very difficult to mandate or declare an optimum balance. But I think we should just be wary or aware of the implications on our organisational cultures and the difference between an organisation that swings to having 3 days working from home and 2 in the office to an organisation that is the other way and maybe does 3 days in the office and 2 at home. And I think it won't necessarily dilute the organisational culture, but it will change the organisational culture. And I think organisations will have to work out where they want to be on that balance. I also agree. I think there will be some organisations where the momentum to get back to the office could become self-fulfilling. But I think the expectations of all of us, but particularly of people joining the workforce, will have changed forever. And I just don't see that you can remain an attractive employer if you're not giving people the opportunity to work in a hybrid manner.
Great, thanks, Rupert. And that issue about organisational culture and how you maintain it with a remote working environment was one of the questions that we didn't manage to get to, so it's really good you picked up on that. Dominic, no pressure, but I'm going to give you the final word on these 2 issues. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I was going to rely on the last refuge of a 30-year civil servant and say in response to the optimum model, it really does depend. I think Stian's absolutely right. The nature of the business, the nature of the workforce is an important driver. But I would go back to that point about the importance of organisations actively managing the impact and the implications. I think an important aspect of that is to continue to learn, to invest in understanding our people's experience, developing that insight and being transparent about that learning and making that visible to all. Culture change and snapping back to the olden days, agree with all of the points that have been made there. I would add every government has got a lot of money to save over the next few years, and we'll be looking hard at its cost base of the service that it delivers. I think most people recognise there have been productivity gains, there have been inclusivity gains, there have been sustainability gains of what has been a forced change in behaviour. We need to see how we can take that and make it be more about a sustained change in the way we think about how we work, where we work and when we work. And I think, an hour and a quarter, we've barely scratched the surface of the issues here. I will see lots more of these kinds of conversations. I hope we do, because, I've got so much out of listening to colleagues on the panel.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I want to say a huge thank you first to our audience for sending in all their questions, fantastically engaged. And thank you so much to Stian, to Anthony, to Rupert and to Dominic for giving such an insight into your experiences. I think it really does show there are lots of complicated issues arising from this. It shows, I think, that the future is not going to be the same. We are definitely entering a different type of future. But what I really like from the conversations is quite often when people talk about hybrid working, they talk about the technology, which is really important, and the security issues and all those kind of things. But you've all made sure that people are at the heart of what you have said today, and listening to people and making sure that it works for the employer, but also for the employee is crucial, I think, to a successful future going forward. So thank you to all of you. I'm afraid we are out of time now, but just to everybody who is listening, we'll be shortly sending a link around with a video of this session. So if you weren't able to watch it all, or you want to share it with colleagues, you will be able to do that. In a couple of weeks, we'll also be publishing an article with all of the key issues from today. So you can also share that with all of your colleagues. And it just leaves me to say a final thank you to EY as well, again, for being our knowledge partner for today and for our brilliant panel. So wherever you are, I know you're all in different time zones around the world. I wish you a lovely rest of the morning, afternoon or evening, and we hope to see you again very soon at another one of these webinars. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye for now. Thank you.